I am Nia, 30 years old, and a senior forensic accountant who tracks down corporate fraud for a living. To the corporate world, I am a predator, but to my family in Atlanta, I am just the unmarried failure who refused to go to law school. Last Christmas Eve, I dragged my suitcase into my family's sprawling estate, expecting the usual chaotic holiday dinner where my mother would parade my sister around like a trophy. Instead, the house was pitch black, freezing cold, and utterly silent. My grandfather was sitting all alone in his wheelchair in the dark. When I found the cruel sticky note my mother left on the kitchen counter, my blood boiled. I reached for my phone to call the police, but before I could dial, my demented grandfather smoothly stood up from his wheelchair, turned on the lights, and changed my life forever. Before I tell you how we destroyed my family's fake empire in 3 days, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have ever been the scapegoat in your family, only to prove them all wrong. Growing up, my mother, Vivian, demanded absolute black excellence. She was a prominent figure in her church, constantly projecting an image of generational wealth and perfection. My younger sister, Jasmine, played the game flawlessly. She married Preston, an arrogant white investment broker who my mother treated like a savior. I dropped out of my university to build my business, a choice she never forgave. Walking into the foyer that night, I expected the smell of roasted turkey and the sound of jazz music. I expected my mother to immediately criticize my coat or my hair. Instead, the house was dead quiet. I dropped my bags and walked toward the living room. The only sound was the faint creaking of a rocking chair. Grandpa Elijah was sitting in the corner, a wool blanket draped over his lap, staring out the window into the dark yard. He had been diagnosed with severe dementia 6 months prior, or so my mother had loudly announced to anyone who would listen. I rushed over to him, panic tightening my chest. I asked if he was okay, but he just stared ahead. I ran to the kitchen to find his medication, and that is when I saw it. Stuck to the marble island was a bright yellow sticky note in my mother's elegant handwriting. I picked it up, my eyes scanning the words. We took Preston's holiday bonus trip to Paris. Leftovers are in the fridge. Do something useful for once and keep the old man alive. Do not ruin everyone's Christmas with your usual dramatic mess. I stood there reading the words over and over, feeling a toxic mix of humiliation and rage. They abandoned an elderly, incapacitated man in a cold house just to flaunt their status in Europe. Before I could even process the cruelty of the note, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from Preston. Make sure the floors are mopped by the time we get back. Maid work suits you better than whatever fake math job you do anyway. Merry Christmas, loser. My grip on the phone tightened. This was exactly how Preston operated. He loved using his proximity to my sister to put me down constantly, flexing his supposed financial superiority. The text triggered a visceral memory from 3 years ago on the day of his lavish wedding to Jasmine. My mother had forced me to wear a plain black dress and practically act as the catering staff, running around fixing floral arrangements and carrying trays just so I would not be in the official wedding photos. She had told me I looked too rough and unpolished, that Preston's wealthy family would judge them if they saw me standing at the altar as a bridesmaid. I had swallowed my pride back then to keep the peace, silently picking up their dirty champagne flutes while they danced. But right now, standing in this freezing kitchen on Christmas Eve with my abandoned grandfather, the urge to keep the peace completely vanished. I looked at the sticky note, crumpled the paper into a tight ball, and hurled it furiously across the room. I pulled out my cell phone, once again pulling up the keypad to quickly dial the local police. Leaving a vulnerable senior citizen all alone was definitely elder abuse, and I was absolutely ready to let my mother explain her glamorous Paris trip to a skeptical judge. I angrily dialed the very first 9, my thumb hovering right over the final one. I would not do that if I were you, Nia. The voice was deep, steady, and sharp. It did not sound weak, and it certainly did not sound confused. I spun around, nearly dropping my phone. Grandpa Elijah was no longer sitting in his wheelchair. He was standing perfectly upright under the archway of the kitchen. He reached over and calmly flipped the switch, flooding the massive room with bright light. He walked toward me with steady steps, kicking the blanket aside. There was no trace of the vacant, lost stare he had been putting on for the past 6 months. His eyes were focused, calculating, and burning with an intense, quiet fury. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick red legal folder, and dropped it heavily onto the kitchen island next to where the sticky note had been. He looked at me, a cold, knowing smile spreading across his face. "They think I am a senile old fool," he said, his voice echoing in the empty house. "They think they have already won. Good, let them enjoy their flight." He tapped the folder with one finger. "Did you bring your work laptop, granddaughter?" I stared at him, my shock melting into a sudden, thrilling realization. I lowered my phone and nodded. "Excellent," Grandpa Elijah said. "Shall we begin?" I pocketed my phone and silently stared at the heavy red folder resting perfectly on the marble kitchen island. Grandpa flipped the folder open with a sharp flick of his wrist. Inside were legal documents stamped with the Fulton County seal. He slid them across the marble countertop toward me. "Read it," he commanded. I stepped forward and scanned the top page. It was a formal declaration of medical incompetence. An unknown doctor had signed a sworn affidavit stating Elijah was in the advanced stages of Alzheimer's disease and entirely incapable of managing his affairs. Attached to the medical evaluation was a newly minted power of attorney. The executor was my mother Vivian, with Preston listed as her primary financial proxy. My blood ran cold. They had stripped away his autonomy. "They bought a crooked doctor," Grandpa Elijah said, his voice laced with disgust. "Vivian and Preston paid a private physician to evaluate me while I stared at the wall. They think they have absolute control over my estate." I looked up from the papers, my mind racing to connect the dots. "Why would they do this now? Mom has always been obsessed with your money, but forging a medical proxy is a federal crime. That is a massive risk." "Because they are desperate," he replied, leaning against the counter. "And they want the Auburn Avenue properties." Grandpa Elijah owned an entire city block of historic Black-owned commercial real estate in downtown Atlanta. Those buildings were worth tens of millions of dollars, completely debt-free. "Preston convinced your mother that the real estate market was shifting," Grandpa Elijah explained. "He told her those properties needed to be liquidated and reinvested into his elite portfolio. Your mother, completely blinded by her desperate need to sit at the country club with the white elite, agreed to hand over the keys to my kingdom." I did not need to hear another word. I unzipped my suitcase on the kitchen floor and pulled out my work laptop. For years, my family had mocked my career. My mother told her church friends I was just a glorified tax preparer. They had no idea what a senior forensic accountant actually did. They did not understand I spent my days dissecting complex financial crimes and destroying corrupt executives. I booted up my laptop and cracked my knuckles. The scared, isolated daughter was gone. The predator was awake. "I need Preston's corporate credentials," I said, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "He left his backup hard drive in his home office upstairs," Grandpa Elijah said with a wicked grin. "He assumes I am too stupid to know what a server is, and he assumes you are too useless to figure it out." 10 minutes later, I had Preston's hard drive plugged into my laptop. I ran a decryption protocol and bypassed his embarrassingly weak security passwords. The moment I accessed his firm's internal ledgers, the illusion of my perfect brother-in-law shattered. I scrolled through the financial statements, my eyes widening at the absolute disaster on the screen. Preston's elite investment firm was nothing but a hollow shell. He had no major clients. His operational accounts were bleeding cash, and he was drowning in high-interest liabilities. He was a fraud on the brink of total bankruptcy. "This explains everything," I muttered, my eyes scanning a spreadsheet of his personal debts. Preston did not marry Jasmine because he loved her. He married her because he was drowning. He targeted our family because he knew Mom was so desperate for white-collar validation that she would practically hand him the keys to the vault. He needed your clean assets to save himself from prison. "Keep digging," Grandpa Elijah urged, standing right behind my shoulder. "Find out what he did today." I ran a trace on the IP addresses linked to Preston's personal devices. I sifted through the digital footprints he left behind before boarding his luxury flight to Paris. The deeper I went, the more the digital trail reeked of panic. He was moving money, aggressively bouncing funds through multiple dummy accounts to hide the origin point. Suddenly, my screen flashed red. I had hit a secure banking firewall. Preston had initiated a massive high-level transaction that was currently sitting in a pending state due to the holiday bank closures. I launched a backdoor tracking script bypassing the initial firewall to view the pending wire transfer details. My heart dropped into my stomach. "Grandpa," I whispered, staring at the glowing numbers on my screen. Preston initiated a $3 million wire transfer to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. "Using what funds?" he firmly demanded. "He did not use liquid funds," I explained quickly, pulling up the attached collateral documents. "He used the forged power of attorney to take out a massive commercial loan against your Auburn Avenue properties. He leveraged your historic buildings to borrow $3 million in cash." They were not just taking a lavish holiday bonus trip to Paris. Preston was using my grandfather's stolen legacy to fund their luxury European vacation, while simultaneously trying to pay off his dangerous secret debts before his entire firm collapsed. He had left my grandfather in a freezing house to die while he stole his empire. I stared at the pending status on the $3 million wire transfer. The international banking window would open in exactly 48 hours. Once that money cleared the offshore accounts, it would be gone forever, and the bank would seize my grandfather's properties to cover the default. "They think they are untouchable," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They think they have already won." I quickly opened my administrative toolkit and immediately began writing a custom override script. The clock was ticking, but Preston had made one fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the scapegoat. "What exactly are you doing, Nia?" Grandpa Elijah asked. I stared at the screen, a ruthless smile matching his. "I am going to cut the puppet strings." I stared at the blinking cursor on my screen, watching the offshore banking gateway mock me with its digital lock. The clock was ticking. In exactly 48 hours, international banking systems would reopen after the Christmas holiday. The moment that happened, Preston's $3 million wire transfer would fully clear, settling safely into an untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. My grandfather's commercial properties would be officially drained of their equity, and the bank would foreclose on the historic buildings the minute Preston defaulted on the loan. He had engineered a perfect corporate hit disguising his theft under the false narrative of an elite, wealthy son-in-law managing an ailing old man's estate. He expected us to be helpless, ignorant, and financially illiterate. He had no idea who he was dealing with. "We need to stop that wire transfer before the banking window opens," Grandpa Elijah said, his voice calm but layered with a dangerous undertone. "But if we alert the bank now, they will freeze my entire portfolio during the fraud investigation. That could take months. I need my assets fluid to protect my legacy." "I am not going to alert the bank," I replied, my fingers flying across the keyboard. "I am going to override his proxy access and forcefully rip the funds right out of the pending transaction pipeline. But I need supreme authorization, the kind that supersedes a basic forged medical document." "Like this?" Grandpa Elijah asked. He reached into the heavy red folder still resting on the marble island and pulled out a secondary sealed envelope. He broke the wax seal and handed me a pristine watermarked document. It was a supreme financial power of attorney drafted 5 years ago and completely ironclad. More importantly, it named me Nia as the sole irrevocable executor of his entire estate. He had trusted me with his legacy long before my mother ever tried to strip him of it. "This is bulletproof," I said, a genuine smile finally breaking across my face. "With this, I am legally authorized to access the core banking portal and cancel the transaction from the inside out." I initiated a high-level digital counterattack. I bypassed the standard banking app interface and went straight to the institutional backend using my forensic credentials and Grandpa's supreme authorization to force my way into the pending wire transfer queue. Preston had used a sloppy third-party routing server to initiate the transfer, likely trying to distance his own failing firm from the theft. It was a rookie mistake. As I sliced through his amateur firewall, I discovered a hidden server folder labeled Estate Restructuring. I clicked it open, and what I found made my stomach violently churn. It was an entire email chain between Preston and my mother Vivian. They had been plotting this exact theft for months. My eyes scanned the messages, each one more toxic than the last. Preston detailed his plan to exploit Grandpa's brief moments of fatigue to get the crooked doctor to sign the incompetence affidavit. But it was my mother's replies that truly sickened me. "Make sure you secure the funds before Christmas," Vivian had written in an email dated 2 weeks ago. "We need the cash to cover Jasmine's new Range Rover and the Paris trip. As for Nia, that embarrassing unmarried failure is finally going to be useful. She can stay in the freezing house and babysit the old man. Once the properties are liquidated, we will sell the house right out from under them and put her out on the streets where she belongs." I stopped typing. The silence in the kitchen suddenly felt incredibly loud. My own mother, the woman who preached family values every Sunday at church, had actively conspired with a manipulative outsider to steal her father's empire and render her own daughter homeless. She had sold us out just to maintain a fragile illusion of wealth and status. I felt a sharp sting behind my eyes, the familiar urge to cry rising in my throat. But I swallowed the tears down, pushing the grief aside. There was no room for crying anymore. Instead of crying, I went to absolute war. "What did you find?" Grandpa Elijah asked, gently noticing the shift in my posture. "Everything I need," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Using the Supreme Authorization, I accessed the central transaction ledger. I located Preston's $3 million pending wire transfer and highlighted the entire code block. I did not just cancel it. I violently yanked the funds out of the offshore routing process and slammed them directly back into my grandfather's secured internal trust account. The pending transaction vanished from Preston's screen in Paris. The money was safe. But I was not finished. Preston had linked all of his personal credit accounts and Jasmine's luxury spending cards to the fraudulent collateral loan he had attempted to secure against Grandpa's properties. Because he assumed the $3 million would clear, he had already maxed out their current credit limits to pay for the private flights, the designer shopping sprees, and their five-star hotel suite in Paris. He had built a house of cards on stolen money. I pulled up the master control panel for the newly secured trust account. Since I now had absolute administrative control over the origin funds, I had the legal authority to trigger an immediate fraud alert on any account that had attempted to access the stolen money. I highlighted every single credit card registered to Preston and Jasmine globally. "Are you sure about this, Nia?" Grandpa Elijah asked, a deep chuckle rumbling in his chest. "Paris is very expensive this time of year." "They wanted a luxury vacation," I replied, my finger hovering over the execute button. "Let us see how luxurious it feels when they cannot even buy a croissant." I hit the button. A cascading series of red alerts filled my screen. I systematically and ruthlessly froze every active credit card debit account and emergency fund linked to their names. I locked them out of their banking apps and blocked any attempt to initiate international transfers. I completely severed their financial lifeline. I did not just stop the wire transfer, I severed their access to the entire global banking system. They were currently sitting in one of the most expensive cities in the world, surrounded by luxury, and they were utterly, completely broke. I closed my laptop with a satisfying snap. "The trap is set," I said, looking up at Grandpa Elijah. He nodded slowly, his eyes shining with pride. "Now we wait for the fireworks." Christmas morning broke over Atlanta with a crisp, freezing silence. Sunlight poured through the massive windows of the estate, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. For the first time in my entire life, the holiday did not involve walking on eggshells. There was no frantic rushing to prepare an elaborate breakfast to appease my mother's impossible standards. There were no snide comments about my outfit, my hair, or my career choices. It was just me and Grandpa Elijah, sitting comfortably at the marble kitchen island, drinking hot espresso, and eating the leftover pastries I had found in the back of the massive refrigerator. We did not play Christmas music. The quiet anticipation in the room was a symphony all on its own. We both knew the time difference between Atlanta and Paris meant their morning of luxury was rapidly turning into an afternoon of absolute unmitigated chaos. I kept my phone sitting right in the center of the marble counter, its black screen reflecting the ceiling lights. We did not have to wait very long for the inevitable explosion. At exactly 10 in the morning, my phone violently erupted. The loud, jarring ringtone of a FaceTime video call shattered the peaceful silence of the kitchen. The caller ID flashed with Jasmine's name, accompanied by a glamorous photo of her holding a designer handbag. I looked across the island at Grandpa Elijah. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his espresso and gave me a single confirming nod. I reached out and swiped the green button to accept the call, leaning my phone against a large bowl of fruit so the camera fully captured my completely unbothered expression. The screen instantly filled with a shaky, chaotic view of a grand Parisian hotel lobby. The background was visually stunning, featuring towering marble pillars and a massive crystal chandelier, but the foreground was an absolute disaster. Jasmine was gripping the phone, her face flushed dark red with overwhelming panic. Her usually perfect makeup was heavily smudged, and she was breathing incredibly fast. "Nia!" Jasmine screamed into the phone, her shrill voice piercing through the small speaker. "What did you do? You need to fix this right now." I took a calm, relaxed sip of my coffee, leaning closer to the bright screen. "Merry Christmas to you too, Jasmine. How is the City of Light?" "Do not play games with me!" she shrieked, spinning the camera around wildly to show a very angry French hotel manager standing aggressively behind a polished mahogany desk. "Every single one of our premium cards has been utterly declined. The hotel is trying to charge us for the penthouse suite, and the machine keeps saying the accounts are locked. They are literally threatening to call the local police and have us thrown out into the street with our luggage. You work with financial software. You need to call the bank and tell them it is a massive mistake." Before I could utter a single word, the phone was violently snatched out of Jasmine's trembling hand. Preston's face aggressively filled the screen. He was wearing a custom-tailored suit that he undoubtedly bought with stolen money, but he was sweating profusely. His charming white-collar persona had completely evaporated, replaced by the arrogant, commanding sneer he always reserved specifically for me. "Listen to me very carefully, Nia," Preston demanded, pointing his finger directly at the camera lens. "I know you are sitting in my house playing on your little computer. You need to log into your servers and fix whatever technical glitch you just caused. I am an elite investment broker, and I do not have time to deal with your amateur technical errors today. Call the fraud department right now, verify our identities, and unlock my accounts before I have you arrested for cyber tampering." I did not flinch. I just stared at his sweating face, letting the heavy silence stretch out to highlight his pathetic desperation. Then my mother aggressively pushed her way into the frame. Vivian shoved Preston aside, her face contorted with a vicious, toxic rage that I knew all too well. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at the camera. "You jealous, miserable, single loser!" My mother spat, her voice echoing humiliatingly through the luxury hotel lobby. "I knew we should not have left you alone in that house. You are so envious of your sister's perfect marriage and her beautiful life that you actually tried to hack her credit cards to ruin her Christmas vacation. You are a disgusting, ungrateful embarrassment to this entire family. Fix those cards this exact second, or I swear to God I will personally throw all of your belongings out onto the curb the minute we land." I let her finish her unhinged rant. I let all three of them stand in the middle of a foreign country surrounded by wealthy strangers screaming at a tiny phone screen. I did not raise my voice in defense. I did not defend my forensic accounting career. I did not shed a single tear over my mother's horrific abusive insults. Instead, I reached out and calmly tapped the screen, flipping the camera from the front-facing lens to the rear lens. The live video feed immediately shifted away from my calm face. It framed the other side of the marble kitchen island. The screen now perfectly captured Grandpa Elijah. He was sitting up straight, looking impeccably sharp in his tailored morning robe. He casually rested his hands on the heavy red legal folder containing the absolute evidence of their ongoing financial crimes. He raised his espresso cup to the camera lens, his eyes locking directly onto Preston's absolutely terrified face. The frantic screaming on the other end of the line ceased instantly quickly, replaced by a deafening, horrified silence. Grandpa Elijah slowly lowered his cup and stared into the lens with icy authority. "The cards are not experiencing a glitch," Grandpa Elijah said. "I reported them all stolen. Call Interpol." The screen went completely black. Preston had violently ended the call the second the word Interpol left my grandfather's mouth. I sat back against the marble island, letting out a breath I did not even realize I had been holding. The absolute shock on their faces was permanently burned into my memory. For my entire life, my mother and my sister had treated me like a disposable accessory, while Preston treated our family like a bank he could casually rob. Now, they were stranded in Paris with nothing but the designer clothes on their backs. I looked over at Grandpa Elijah. He smoothly closed the heavy red folder and took another slow sip of his espresso. He looked remarkably at peace for a man who had just blown up his daughter's luxury vacation. We both knew the financial war was won. I had successfully severed their access to the stolen $3 million and locked down every single credit account tied to Preston's failing firm. We assumed the next step would be a barrage of angry text messages or desperate pleas for forgiveness. We expected them to beg. We severely underestimated just how vicious Preston could be when backed into a tight corner. Thousands of miles away in a Parisian hotel lobby, Preston was not figuring out how to apologize. He was figuring out how to retaliate. Stripped of his stolen funds and facing imminent public humiliation, his arrogant white-collar persona completely fractured. He could no longer rely on his financial superiority to control my family. He needed a different weapon, and he chose the most lethal one available to him. He chose to weaponize the police against a black household in the affluent suburbs of Atlanta. Using a virtual private network application on his smartphone, Preston bypassed international cellular restrictions and masked his physical location. He dialed the direct emergency dispatch line for Fulton County. When the emergency operator answered, Preston did not scream or panic. He meticulously slipped into the character of a deeply concerned, wealthy white son-in-law. He lowered his voice, injecting just the right amount of desperate urgency into his tone. He told the dispatcher that he was currently out of the country on a business trip and had received a terrifying phone call from his estate. He completely fabricated a story that his mentally unstable sister-in-law had suffered a violent psychotic break. He explicitly stated that I had illegally trapped my wealthy elderly grandfather inside the house against his will. To guarantee a massive tactical response, Preston added one final calculated lie. He told the dispatcher that I was actively destroying the property and had access to my grandfather's registered firearms. It was a textbook swatting attempt. He knew exactly what happens when heavily armed tactical units are dispatched to a tense situation involving black residents. He was not just trying to scare me, he was actively trying to get me killed. While Preston was orchestrating a potential tragedy over a digital connection, the atmosphere inside our Atlanta estate was a picture of absolute serenity. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip below the tree line, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floors of the grand living room. I took a deep breath and inhaled the crisp scent of pine from the tall Christmas tree standing in the corner. The bright lights on the green branches felt like a celebration of our newfound freedom from years of emotional abuse and systemic financial manipulation. I had moved my work setup from the kitchen island to the large mahogany coffee table. I was deep in my element as a forensic accountant, systematically archiving the digital evidence of Preston's extensive wire fraud. I created secure backup folders containing the forged medical affidavits, the unauthorized loan applications, and the damning email chains between him and my mother. I was building a bulletproof prosecution file for the federal authorities. Grandpa Elijah was sitting comfortably in his favorite leather recliner, reviewing the recovered bank statements I had printed out for him. He was meticulously calculating the exact amount of money my mother had secretly siphoned from his minor accounts over the past 2 years to fund her country club lifestyle. The house was quiet, warm, and safe. We felt completely victorious. I finally had the hard evidence to prove my mother's toxic vanity and Preston's predatory manipulation. I was no longer the scapegoat, and Grandpa Elijah was no longer the helpless victim. We had taken back the power. I smiled as I hit the final save button on my secure encrypted drive. I stood up, adjusting my dark sweater against the chill that lingered in the crisp evening air. The profound realization that I was finally in complete control of my own destiny felt incredibly intoxicating. I took one step toward the massive kitchen archway, fully intending to prepare our long-awaited celebratory meal. I looked over at Grandpa Elijah to ask him exactly what he wanted to eat. The words never left my mouth. The peaceful silence of the living room was instantly shattered by the screeching halt of heavy tires skidding onto the gravel driveway. Before I could even stand up from the sofa, intense blinding beams of flashing red and blue lights violently pierced through the sheer curtains of the front windows. The strobing lights painted the living room walls in a chaotic, terrifying rhythm. A heavy, booming voice amplified by a police megaphone echoed through the thick glass, commanding everyone inside the residence to step away from the windows and keep their hands visible. My heart slammed against my ribs. I looked at Grandpa Elijah, the color draining completely from my face. We had expected angry phone calls from Paris, not a tactical police raid in Atlanta. Then came the sound that makes your blood run absolutely cold. It was the sudden, deafening, aggressive, and incredibly violent pounding of heavy police fists striking the solid oak of our locked front door. Atlanta Police Department, open the door immediately. The voice on the other side of the heavy wood was muffled but carried absolute terrifying authority. Before I could even command my legs to move, the massive oak door was violently kicked open, splintering the heavy wooden frame and sending sharp shards of debris flying across the pristine foyer. A highly militarized tactical team swarmed into the living room. They moved with terrifying speed and precision, their heavy black boots stomping onto the hardwood floors. Bright, blinding beams from tactical flashlights cut through the warm, golden glow of our Christmas tree, completely blinding me. The serene sanctuary of our home was instantly transformed into a terrifying war zone. Multiple officers screamed conflicting commands, their voices overlapping in a chaotic, deafening roar. "Show me your hands. Get on the ground. Do not move." As an African-American woman, this was my absolute worst nightmare brought to terrifying life. I knew exactly how quickly these situations could escalate into irreversible tragedies. I did not argue. I did not ask questions. I immediately dropped to my knees, raising my empty hands high above my head, praying that my sudden movements would not be misinterpreted as a threat. A heavy hand grabbed my shoulder and forcefully shoved me face down onto the expensive Persian rug. The rough fibers scratched against my cheek as an officer jammed his knee aggressively into the center of my back. The cold, heavy metal of a steel handcuff clamped tightly around my left wrist, biting sharply into my skin. Panic clawed at my throat, threatening to suffocate me, but I forced myself to breathe evenly. I kept my eyes locked on the floor, absolutely terrified that looking up might provoke them further. The sheer volume of the screaming officers was disorienting. They were operating under the false malicious narrative that Preston had deliberately fed them. They believed they were rescuing a helpless, vulnerable hostage from a violent, mentally unstable captor. "Secure the suspect," one of the tactical officers yelled, his voice echoing loudly above my head. "Locate the victim. Make sure the elderly male is out of the line of fire." Another officer aimed the blinding beam of his rifle flashlight directly into the corner of the room where my grandfather was still standing. "Sir, step away from her," the officer commanded, his voice tight with adrenaline. "You are safe now. Keep your hands visible and step slowly toward us." The officers expected my grandfather to cower. They expected a frail, confused Alzheimer's patient who would weep with gratitude for being rescued from his malicious granddaughter. They were severely mistaken. Grandpa Elijah did not raise his hands. He did not step forward to seek the false comfort of their heavily armored tactical line. Instead, he stood perfectly still, squaring his broad shoulders and lifting his chin. He looked directly into the blinding light of the tactical rifle, completely unfazed by the overwhelming show of lethal force. The atmosphere in the living room suddenly shifted. The chaotic, aggressive energy of the raid met an immovable, deeply rooted wall of absolute authority. Grandpa Elijah took one slow, deliberate step forward, his polished leather shoes tapping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Remove your knee from my granddaughter's spine this exact second," he ordered. His voice was not the shaky, terrified plea of a victim. It was a booming, resonant baritone that carried the crushing weight of absolute command. It was a voice accustomed to silencing crowded courtrooms and dictating the fates of dangerous men. The tactical officer kneeling on my back hesitated, the sheer authority of my grandfather's tone clearly catching him entirely off guard. "I said, get your hands off her!" Grandpa Elijah thundered, taking another step forward, closing the distance between himself and the tactical team. "You have unlawfully breached a private residence without a verified warrant, operating on a fabricated emergency dispatch call initiated from a foreign country. You are currently assaulting the legal executor of my estate." The lead officer lowered his weapon slightly, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. This was not the hostage scenario he had been briefed on. "Sir, please remain calm," the commanding officer said, trying to regain control of the rapidly deteriorating situation. "We received a credible, verified threat that you were being held against your will by an armed, unstable relative. We are here to ensure your absolute safety." Grandpa Elijah let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed chillingly through the tense room. "The only threat to my safety in this house is the group of trigger-happy men currently pointing loaded weapons at my family. I am completely lucid, entirely unharmed, and highly infuriated. Now, before I dismantle this entire department with a single phone call, I demand to know who authorized this catastrophic failure of a raid. State your name and your badge number immediately, officer." The commanding officer stood frozen, caught between his tactical training and the realization that he had walked into a massive mistake. He holstered his weapon, gesturing for the others to lower their rifles. The officer on my back lifted his knee and stepped away, leaving the handcuffs dangling loosely from my wrist. I sat up, rubbing my bruised shoulder, keeping my eyes fixed on my grandfather. Elijah did not wait for the flustered officer to speak. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored coat. The tactical team tensed their hands, hovering nervously over their holstered weapons, but he simply did not pull out a firearm. With slow, calm precision, he pulled out a worn black leather wallet. He flipped it open and held it directly into the harsh glare of their flashlights. The shiny gold federal emblem gleamed brightly in the center of the living room. "My name is Elijah, and I am a retired federal district judge for the Northern District of Georgia. And unless I am mistaken, I am the man who personally signed your current Chief of Police's Academy graduation certificate." Sources. The silence in the living room was absolute. The tactical officers stared at my grandfather, their weapons fully lowered, completely paralyzed by his revelation. The commanding officer swallowed hard, color draining from his face. He reached up, keyed his microphone, and ordered his men to stand down. His voice trembled with profound regret. He requested immediate contact with the chief of police, emphasizing a code-red priority. The chaotic nightmare Preston orchestrated from Paris was rapidly unraveling. Within 20 minutes, flashing lights outside our windows multiplied. The heavy thud of car doors slamming echoed up the driveway, followed by the authoritative footsteps of Chief Marcus Thorne. He was a tall, imposing African-American man who commanded the room the second he walked through our splintered front door. He took one look at the tactical team standing awkwardly in the foyer, then shifted his gaze to my grandfather. Chief Thorne removed his hat, his posture straightening into unwavering respect. "Judge," Chief Thorne said, his voice thick with disbelief and apology, "I cannot even begin to explain how deeply sorry I am for this catastrophic breach of protocol. The dispatch center received a Priority 1 distress call. The caller specifically identified himself as your son-in-law, claiming a violent hostage situation was actively unfolding." Grandpa Elijah gestured for the chief to step further into the living room. "I know exactly who made that call, Marcus. My son-in-law is currently sitting in Paris. He used a virtual private network to spoof a local Atlanta area code and weaponized your tactical units against my granddaughter. He did this because Nia just caught him attempting to steal $3 million from my commercial real estate portfolio. Chief Thorne turned his sharp gaze toward me. He looked at the heavy steel handcuffs violently clamped onto my wrist, just moments before his jaw clenching with barely suppressed fury. He immediately ordered the commanding officer to remove the cuffs and formally apologize. As the cold metal unlocked, I did not rub my skin or show weakness. I simply walked over to the mahogany coffee table, flipped open my laptop, and turned the glowing screen toward the chief of police. "My name is Nia," I said, my voice steady and professional. "I am a senior forensic accountant, and I have the digital footprint to prove every single word my grandfather just said." Chief Thorne walked over and looked down at the complex spreadsheets illuminating the dark room. I walked him through the sequence of events. I showed him the forged medical affidavit Preston and my mother purchased from a corrupt physician. I displayed the fraudulent loan applications Preston submitted using my grandfather's historic properties as collateral. Then I pulled up the digital trace of the fake emergency dispatch call. I showed the chief how Preston routed the audio through a masked server in Switzerland before hitting the switchboard. "This is not just domestic swatting," I explained, pointing to the pending wire transfer logs. "Preston is running a hollow investment firm drowning in high-interest liabilities. He orchestrated this European vacation to get my grandfather out of the house, forged the power of attorney, and initiated a massive wire transfer to cover his tracks. When I used my grandfather's legitimate authorization to freeze his accounts and intercept the stolen money, Preston retaliated by trying to get me killed." The chief of police stared at the screen, the magnitude of the crime sinking in. Swatting a residence was a severe felony. Swatting a retired federal district judge combined with aggravated wire fraud, elder abuse, and money laundering escalated the situation to a massive federal level. Chief Thorne pulled out his radio and ordered the tactical team to evacuate the premises. The living room felt lighter as the men filed out the door, leaving just the three of us standing by the Christmas tree. "I am calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately," Chief Thorne stated, pulling out his cell phone. "We are going to flag his passport. The second Preston and your mother touch down at John F. Kennedy Airport, I will have a team of federal marshals waiting at the gate. We will pull him straight off the plane in handcuffs. He will not even make it to the baggage claim." It was a tempting offer. The thought of Preston being publicly humiliated and dragged away in front of hundreds of travelers was incredibly satisfying. I could picture my mother screaming and crying as her white-collar savior was treated like a common criminal. It would be a swift, brutal end to their luxurious delusion. But as I looked at the lights of the Christmas tree and then down at the damning evidence spread across my laptop, a much better idea formed in my mind. Arresting them at the airport was too easy. It was too removed from the damage they tried to inflict on this house. I reached out and gently placed my hand over the chief's phone, stopping him before he could dial the federal authorities. "No," I said, a calculated smile spreading across my face. "Do not arrest them at the airport. Let them board their connecting flight. Let them endure the long, humiliating journey back to Atlanta in economy class. Let them take a cheap rideshare up this driveway." Chief Thorne looked at me, confusion mixing with deep curiosity. "You want them to come back here after he just sent a tactical unit to your front door?" "Exactly," I replied, my voice dropping to a calm, icy whisper. "Preston thinks he is completely untouchable because of his perceived corporate status. My mother thinks she is superior simply because she associates with him. They deeply believe this historic house is their ultimate final prize. Let them make it all the way back to this very living room expecting to find me terrified and completely defeated. I want to look them dead in the eye. I want to see their faces when the illusion shatters." While the tactical units cleared out of my grandfather's driveway in Atlanta, the reality of my digital counterattack was crashing down on my family in the heart of Paris. The pristine gilded lobby of their five-star hotel had transformed into the stage for their absolute public humiliation. The fiercely polite but unyielding French hotel manager stood flanked by two heavily built security guards. They were treating Preston like a common vagrant. His premium corporate cards were frozen, his personal accounts were completely locked, and the luxury suite they had occupied for exactly one night was now strictly off-limits. Jasmine was practically hyperventilating near the concierge desk. Desperately clutching her matching designer luggage, she was firmly escorted by the security guards toward the grand revolving doors. "You cannot do this to us!" Jasmine shrieked, her voice cracking as several wealthy international guests stopped to stare. "My husband is an incredibly wealthy man. This is just a banking error. You are going to be fired for treating us like this." Preston did not intervene, too busy furiously swiping at his dead cell phone with a pale, sweating face. He knew exactly why the cards were declining, but he could not admit to my mother and sister that his entire financial empire was a complete fabricated lie. Vivian, however, was absolutely furious. She marched out of the Grand Hotel doors onto the Parisian pavement. She did not blame Preston for the catastrophic failure of his bank accounts. She entirely blamed me for everything. "I am going to destroy her," my mother hissed, pulling her fur coat tightly around her shoulders as the freezing European wind hit them. "The second we get back to Atlanta, I am going to pack all of Nia's cheap belongings in garbage bags and throw them onto the highway. She is going to pay for humiliating me in front of these people." But getting back to Atlanta required money, a resource they suddenly completely lacked. Preston patted his pockets, pulling out a measly €200 in loose cash. It was barely enough to buy lunch. They stood on the extravagant Parisian streets surrounded by high-end boutiques and wealthy tourists completely destitute. Their illusion of wealth had evaporated. "We need to get to the airport right now," Preston commanded, his voice sharp and panicked. "I have to get back to my corporate office to fix this server issue in person. Jasmine, give me your watch." Jasmine pulled her arm back, clutching her wrist. "Are you insane? You gave me this diamond Rolex for our first anniversary. I am not giving it to you." "Give me the damn watch, Jasmine," Preston barked, stepping toward her with an aggression she had never seen before. "We have absolutely zero cash. How else do you suggest we buy plane tickets back to America, unless your mother wants to part with her vintage Chanel collection?" My mother instinctively clutched her 3 luxury handbags against her chest, looking completely horrified. The idea of pawning her precious designer accessories like a common criminal was a fate worse than death to her. She prided herself on showing off those bags to her judgmental church friends every Sunday, but Preston was not asking for permission. He grabbed the largest bag out of her hands. He grabbed Jasmine's wrist, unclasped the diamond Rolex, and shoved it into his pocket. He flagged down a cheap taxi and ordered the driver to take them to a pawn district away from the luxury center. They walked into a dingy pawn shop 2 hours later. The bored appraiser behind the thick glass counter took one look at their desperate faces and knew exactly how to exploit them. He offered them a fraction of what the items were actually worth. My mother actually wept real tears as the man tossed a banded stack of euros across the counter in exchange for her pristine limited edition handbags. Preston snatched the cash immediately, counting it with trembling fingers. It was just enough money to buy 3 basic economy class tickets back to the United States. By the time they reached Charles de Gaulle Airport, the cracks in Preston and Jasmine's perfect marriage had widened into massive, irreparable fractures. They stood in the endless crowded line for the cheapest carrier available. Jasmine was openly sobbing, complaining about having to fly in coach for 10 hours surrounded by crying babies and common people. "If you were actually the elite broker you claim to be, you would have an emergency offshore account," Jasmine yelled at him, not caring who heard her. "My sister is a basic accountant and she managed to freeze your entire life. You are completely useless, Preston." Preston turned on her, his eyes blazing with a toxic, unfiltered hatred. "Do not ever speak to me like that. I married into your family to elevate you. You and your mother were nothing but pathetic, status-obsessed social climbers until I gave you my last name." My mother gasped, stepping between them. "Preston, how dare you speak to my daughter that way? We are a family of excellence." Preston let out a dark laugh, turning his back on both of them. As Jasmine and my mother continued to loudly argue, Preston pulled out his secondary phone. He looked around nervously, ensuring no one was watching his screen. He was not just checking their flight status. He was desperately logging into a hidden, secure banking portal. He typed a frantic message to his private offshore banker, ordering an immediate, emergency transfer of his remaining hidden assets to a dummy corporation in Delaware before he landed in the United States. He smirked, confident he was one step ahead of me. He truly believed his white-collar privilege would easily protect his stolen wealth. He had absolutely no idea that I was already sitting quietly in my grandfather's living room, drinking a warm cup of coffee, and watching his exact keystrokes light up my secure server in real time. I watched the code cascade across my laptop screen, tracking every panicked keystroke Preston made on his secondary device. He was standing in Charles de Gaulle Airport trying to salvage his pride by moving his hidden assets. He thought his accounts were invisible. He believed his Cayman Islands portal was a fortress an accountant could never breach. Forensic accounting is not about brute force. It is about human desperation. Preston was terrified, and terrified men make incredibly loud digital footprints. As he initiated a transfer to sweep funds into a blind shell company in Delaware, he unknowingly opened a two-way digital bridge. I did not just watch him move money. I rode his connections straight into the central database of his entire fraudulent empire. He is trying to hide his personal stash, I said, my fingers flying across the keyboard to capture the data packets before the connection closed. He is routing everything through a corporate entity called Apex Holdings. Give me minutes to crack the ledger. Grandpa Elijah leaned forward in his leather chair, the warmth of the fireplace illuminating the hard lines of his face. Tear it all down to the foundation, Nia. Leave him absolutely nothing. I launched a decryption sequence on the Apex Holdings files. The progress bar filled rapidly, and suddenly the master ledger of Preston's elite investment firm flooded my screen. What I saw made my breath catch in my throat. I had known Preston was broke and desperate enough to steal $3 million from my grandfather. I had absolutely no idea he was running a massive systemic Ponzi scheme. The spreadsheets detailed dozens of wealthy, unsuspecting clients who had trusted Preston with their retirement funds and corporate portfolios. Instead of investing their money, Preston had been siphoning millions into his offshore accounts to fund his lavish lifestyle and cover catastrophic trading losses. The $3 million he tried to steal from Grandpa Elijah was not meant to buy a house or start a business. It was a desperate last-minute patch to stop his entire fraudulent structure from collapsing inward. As I cross-referenced the dates on his financial liabilities, a dark and sickening pattern began to emerge. I opened a separate window and pulled up the public records of the Securities and Exchange Commission. I matched the dates of their initial inquiries into Preston's firm with the timeline of his personal life. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Grandpa, I whispered, my eyes scanning the corresponding dates. Preston did not just meet Jasmine by accident at that charity gala 3 years ago. He targeted her. Elijah set his coffee mug down, his expression turning to stone. Explain what you mean. 3 years and 2 months ago, the federal government sent Preston a preliminary notice of investigation regarding missing client funds. I explained, highlighting the documents on my screen. He was drowning. He needed a massive infusion of clean, untraceable capital to balance his books before the auditors arrived. Exactly 2 weeks after receiving that federal notice, he miraculously bumped into Jasmine. He knew she came from a wealthy Black family. He knew Mom was absolutely desperate for validation from the white elite. He knew Mom would practically force Jasmine to marry him if he flashed a nice watch and a fake portfolio. He married my sister specifically because your debt-free historic commercial real estate empire was the perfect collateral to bail him out of federal prison. The silence in the living room was heavy and suffocating. My mother had spent the last 3 years parading Preston around our church and our community as the ultimate prize. She had mocked my career, belittled my choices, and forced me to serve drinks at their wedding, all because she believed Preston was elevating our family status. In reality, he was a financial predator who viewed my sister as nothing more than a convenient, oblivious shield. Jasmine was not his beloved wife. She was his emergency exit strategy. Grandpa Elijah closed his eyes for a brief moment, the devastating reality of his granddaughter's fake marriage sinking in. When he opened his eyes again, the retired judge had completely returned. There was no sadness left in his gaze, only a terrifying righteous demand for absolute justice. Your mother sold her own children out for the illusion of prestige, Grandpa Elijah said, his voice rumbling with quiet fury. She invited a wolf into our home and demanded we set the table for him. Now we are going to skin him alive. I nodded, a fierce determination replacing any lingering shock. Preston had assumed that his white-collar privilege would protect him from scrutiny. He assumed that a black family from Atlanta would be too intimidated by his corporate jargon to ever question his authority. He had built his entire survival strategy on our supposed ignorance. It was time to introduce him to the devastating reality of my actual profession. I compiled every single piece of decrypted evidence. I gathered the forged medical affidavit, the fraudulent loan applications, the offshore bank routing numbers, and the massive undeniable ledger of his multi-million-dollar Ponzi scheme. I packaged the files into a highly secured encrypted digital dossier. I did not need to call the local police for this level of financial devastation. I needed the heavy artillery. I picked up my cell phone and dialed a direct, unlisted number I had acquired during my years of corporate forensic investigations. The phone rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered on the other end. Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, Agent Vance speaking. I leaned back against the sofa, staring at the glowing lights of the Christmas tree. Agent Vance, I said, a dangerous smile touching the corners of my mouth. My name is Nia. I have a present for you. Check your secure inbox. I just sent you 10 years of tax fraud. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of a keyboard as Special Agent Vance opened the encrypted digital dossier I had just transmitted to his secure federal server. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was seeing the meticulously hidden Cayman Islands accounts, the fabricated client portfolios, and the massive bleeding crater of Preston's failing investment firm. I sat back on the plush sofa in my grandfather's living room, watching the lights on the Christmas tree twinkle, waiting for the federal agent to process the absolute financial massacre glowing on his monitor. When Vance finally spoke, his crisp, professional tone had shifted into something far more intense. He asked me how I had acquired this level of classified financial data. I did not hesitate. I told him my name, my credentials as a senior forensic accountant, and precisely how my white brother-in-law had just attempted to use my African-American grandfather's historic commercial real estate empire to bail himself out of a looming federal indictment. I handed the phone to Chief Marcus Thorne, who was still standing right next to the fireplace. The local police chief quickly verified my grandfather's identity as a retired federal district judge and corroborated the severity of the situation. He explained the fake emergency dispatch call Preston had made from Paris, which had sent a heavily armed tactical team crashing through our front door just an hour earlier. The combination of local police verification, a federal judge's involvement, and my digital evidence created an immediate perfect storm of jurisdictional cooperation. We had the absolute full attention of the United States government. I took the phone back from Chief Thorne, placing it on speaker so Grandpa Elijah could hear every single word. I told Agent Vance that I was not just handing him a prime suspect on a silver platter. I needed to execute a highly specific surgical financial maneuver before Preston ever stepped foot back on American soil. I walked the federal agent through my strategy. Using the supreme authorization my grandfather had granted me, I began to legally dismantle the corporate bridge Preston had secretly built between his toxic shell companies and our family's generational wealth. I severed the joint accounts. I revoked the fraudulent collateral claims. I systematically isolated the $3 million liability, ripping it away from Grandpa Elijah's historic Auburn Avenue properties and dropping the crushing unsecured debt entirely onto the personal Social Security numbers of Preston and my sister Jasmine. I legally divorced my family's legacy from his parasitic greed. By the time I hit the final execution command, Preston was no longer a wealthy corporate broker managing a family trust. He was just a desperate, broke criminal, drowning in millions of dollars of personal debt. Agent Vance verified the digital separation on his end, confirming that my grandfather's assets were completely shielded from the impending federal seizure of Preston's firm. With the financial guillotine securely in place, I pitched my unconventional plan to the authorities. I told Agent Vance and Chief Thorne that arresting Preston at John F. Kennedy Airport was the wrong move. If federal marshals pulled him off a connecting flight in a public terminal, his corporate survival instincts would immediately kick in. He would demand a lawyer, invoke his right to remain silent, and drag my family through years of exhausting, highly publicized litigation. My mother, Vivian, would inevitably hire expensive defense attorneys to protect her golden child daughter and her precious white-collar son-in-law, draining whatever resources she had left just to save face in front of her judgmental church congregation. I needed to break their toxic delusion completely, and I needed to do it in the very house they had plotted to steal. I requested that the federal agents coordinate directly with Chief Thorne to confront Preston here in the living room the moment he walked through the splintered front door. Catching an arrogant narcissist completely off guard, stripped of his stolen wealth, and surrounded by the very people he thought he had outsmarted was the absolute best way to secure an immediate unscripted confession. Agent Vance agreed. The sheer volume of evidence I had provided earned me the tactical leverage I needed. The waiting game began. Chief Thorne dispatched his remaining officers to secure the perimeter of the affluent neighborhood, ensuring no one would tip off the returning travelers. Grandpa Elijah sat quietly in his leather recliner, his eyes sharp and focused, mentally preparing to face the daughter who had actively conspired to abandon him. I sat at the mahogany coffee table, my eyes glued to the flight tracking software on my laptop screen. I watched the tiny digital airplane icon inch its way across the Atlantic Ocean, carrying 3 miserable, completely broke people who thought they were returning to conquer an empire. The hours ticked by in a tense electric silence. We did not sleep. We did not eat. We simply waited for the inevitable collision of their blinding arrogance and our cold, hard reality. Outside, the freezing Atlanta night slowly gave way to a crisp, gray winter morning. The warm sun barely peeked over the tall, beautiful pine trees surrounding the historic estate, casting long, dark shadows across the frost-covered lawn. The tension in the air was palpable and thick. Suddenly, my laptop chimed with a sharp, high-pitched notification. I leaned forward, staring at the screen. The international flight had officially touched down on the tarmac at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport. Right at that exact second, the heavy crunch of thick tires rolling over the gravel driveway echoed through the quiet house. I looked out the front window. A massive black government SUV pulled smoothly into Grandpa Elijah's driveway. The trap was set. I smiled and closed my laptop screen. The time for justice had finally arrived, and there was no escape for them. 30 miles away from our quiet, heavily guarded estate, the chaotic reality of international commercial travel was breaking my family's spirit. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport was completely packed with holiday travelers, but Preston, Jasmine, and my mother were not walking through the exclusive private terminal they were accustomed to. They had just spent 10 agonizing hours crammed into the middle seats of the cheapest economy class flight available. Their journey had been a complete nightmare of crying toddlers, terrible food, and the crushing realization that their glamorous facade had evaporated. They stood shivering on the crowded curbside pickup island, waiting for a basic rideshare vehicle because Preston's premium black car service account was entirely frozen. The humid, freezing Atlanta wind whipped through my mother's thin coat. She looked absolutely horrific. Her perfectly styled hair was flattened against her skull, and her expensive makeup had settled into the deep, angry lines around her mouth. Jasmine was violently shivering next to her, clutching a cheap plastic duty-free shopping bag that held the few pathetic items she had not pawned on the streets of Paris. "Where is the damn car?" Preston roared, pacing back and forth on the concrete curb. "I requested this driver 20 minutes ago. This entire city is completely useless." "Do not yell at me." Jasmine snapped back, her voice hoarse from crying across the Atlantic Ocean. "You are the supposed financial genius who got us kicked out of a 5-star hotel. I had to sit next to a man who smelled like stale cheese for 10 hours. My back is completely ruined. You promised me a life of luxury, Preston. You promised me I would never have to travel like a commoner ever again. Preston turned on her with a vicious, predatory glare. He pointed a shaking finger directly at her face. You need to shut your mouth right now, Jasmine. The only reason we are standing on this freezing curb is because your psychotic, jealous sister decided to play games with my secured servers. She clearly suffered a massive mental breakdown. The second I walk through that front door, I am calling a psychiatric evaluation team. I am going to have Nia committed to a state hospital involuntarily. She is going to rot in a padded room for the rest of her pathetic, miserable life. My mother ignored their vicious arguing. Vivian was entirely focused on her own survival strategy. She held a small, cracked compact mirror up to her face, aggressively wiping the smeared mascara from under her eyes. She was already practicing the elaborate, fabricated lies she would feed to her elite church congregation on Sunday morning. The weather in Paris was simply dreadful, my mother murmured to her reflection, testing the wealthy cadence of her voice. We simply had to return home early. Preston had a sudden, highly classified corporate acquisition to oversee. You know how demanding the life of a top-tier investment broker can be. We simply could not ignore his vital clients. Preston scoffed loudly, shooting my mother a look of pure disgust. Nobody cares about your pathetic church friends, Vivian. Stop practicing your ridiculous lies and help me look for the license plate. I have millions of dollars to secure before the federal banking window opens tomorrow morning. A dented silver sedan finally pulled up to the curb. It was a standard budget rideshare vehicle that smelled strongly of cheap air freshener and stale cigarette smoke. Preston aggressively threw their remaining bags into the small trunk, cursing at the driver for not helping him. The ride to our historic family estate took 45 agonizing minutes. The cramped, silent car ride only fueled the toxic, boiling rage festering inside all three of them. Preston sat in the front seat, aggressively tapping his foot against the floorboard, mentally rehearsing the exact words he would use to destroy me. He firmly believed his white-collar privilege and his aggressive corporate tone would instantly cower me into submission. He truly thought he could just walk in, scream in my face, and demand I unlock his fraudulent accounts. The silver sedan finally turned onto our street, but the driver stopped at the very bottom of our long, winding gravel driveway. Preston angrily argued with the driver, demanding to be taken all the way up to the front porch. The driver simply refused, citing the deep gravel and his worn tires, and ordered them to get out. Preston slammed the car door with enough force to shake the vehicle. My family was forced to drag their own cheap luggage and plastic bags up the steep, freezing hill in the dark. This is entirely Nia's fault. My mother hissed, her breath pluming in the freezing air as her expensive heels slipped on the loose gravel. I am going to pack every single piece of her cheap clothing into garbage bags. She is dead to me. I am kicking her out of this family tonight. She will be lucky if I let her leave with her clothes, Preston growled, cracking his knuckles as the imposing brick facade of the estate loomed over them. I am going to make her beg on her hands and knees before I call the men in white coats to drag her away. They reached the wide concrete steps of the front porch. The house was completely dark, exactly as they expected. To them, the silence meant I was inside, terrified, and hiding from their inevitable wrath. Preston violently jammed his key into the heavy oak front door. He twisted the lock and aggressively kicked the door open, the wood banging loudly against the interior wall. They stepped into the pitch-black foyer, dropping their cheap bags onto the hardwood floor. "Nia!" Preston roared into the darkness, his voice echoing with absolute venomous hatred. "Get out here right now. Your miserable, pathetic little game is officially over." Jasmine and Vivian stormed down the dark hallway right behind him, their faces twisted with malicious anticipation. They marched aggressively toward the living room archway, ready to unleash absolute hell. They stepped over the threshold, opening their mouths to scream my name again, only to stop absolutely dead in their tracks as the living room lights suddenly blazed on. The sudden, blinding illumination of the grand living room chandelier caught them completely off guard. Preston, Jasmine, and my mother stood frozen under the arched doorway, their faces pale and twisted with profound exhaustion and toxic rage. I did not jump up from my seat. I did not flinch or cower. I remained perfectly positioned in the center of the plush velvet sofa, my legs elegantly crossed. I lifted a delicate porcelain teacup to my lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip of warm chamomile tea. I let the absolute silence stretch across the vast room, forcing them to absorb the undeniable reality that I was not the terrified, submissive scapegoat they had expected to find hiding in the dark. I placed the teacup down onto its matching saucer with a soft, sharp clink that echoed against the hardwood floor. The sound acted like a starting pistol. Preston was the first to break the paralyzing silence. He dropped his cheap plastic duty-free bag onto the floor and charged directly across the room toward me. The veins in his neck were bulging against his collar, his face flushed with an unhinged, violent fury. He stopped just inches from the mahogany coffee table, leaning his upper body forward as if he wanted to reach across the wood and physically strangle me. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face, his chest heaving with heavy breaths. "You have crossed a massive, unforgivable line this time, Nia." Preston roared, his voice cracking under the intense pressure of his own panic. "You completely locked me out of my own servers. You froze every single corporate and personal account I own. I am an elite investment broker, and you have severely damaged my financial reputation. I am going to bury you under so many aggressive federal lawsuits that you will never see the light of day again. You are going to rot in a federal prison for corporate espionage and cyber terrorism." I did not blink. I just looked at him with an expression of mild, detached amusement. Before I could even offer a response, Jasmine pushed her way past Preston, her heels stomping aggressively against the Persian rug. She pointed her finger at me, mimicking her husband's toxic entitlement. "You are completely insane," Jasmine shrieked, her voice echoing painfully through the large room. "You ruined my luxury vacation. We had to fly back in economy class sitting next to absolute peasants. I had to pawn my diamond anniversary watch just to afford the tickets home. You are going to get down on your hands and knees right now and apologize to us for destroying our Christmas trip. You are going to log into your stupid little computer and unlock my credit cards this second. If you do not fix this immediately, I will personally make sure you never work in the financial sector again." My mother was the last to step forward. Vivian marched toward the coffee table, her posture rigid with an arrogant matriarchal fury. She refused to acknowledge the fact that she looked completely disheveled after her miserable commercial flight. She slapped her hand violently against the mahogany table, the loud smack intended to immediately assert her dominance. She glared at me, her eyes burning with a deep systemic hatred that I had endured my entire life. "You ungrateful, miserable disappointment," my mother hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. "I gave you strict, simple instructions to clean this house and take care of your grandfather while we were away. Instead, you throw a hysterical, jealous temper tantrum because you cannot handle the fact that your sister is married to a highly successful man. You have humiliated me for the absolute last time. I want you to walk upstairs, pack all of your cheap belongings into garbage bags, and leave this property forever. I am officially kicking you out of this family. You are completely dead to me." Their vitriol washed over me, but it no longer possessed the power to cause me pain. For 30 years, I had internalized their cruel insults. I had believed I was a failure simply because I did not conform to their superficial status-obsessed definitions of success. I had allowed my mother to dictate my worth, and I had allowed my sister to treat me like a lower-class citizen in my own home. But sitting on that sofa armed with the undeniable, devastating truth of their horrific financial crimes, their insults sounded like the desperate, pathetic whining of cornered animals. They were not powerful. They were completely and utterly powerless. They had built an entire empire of glass and sand, and they were standing right in the middle of it, demanding that I stop the wind from blowing. They believed their aggressive shouting would eventually force me to submit, just like it always had in the past. They waited for me to cry, to apologize, and to beg for my mother's toxic forgiveness. I did not shed a single tear for any of them. I did not offer a frantic apology or ever attempt to justify my actions. I simply smiled a slow, predatory grin that caused the confident arrogance on Preston's face to slightly falter. I picked up my porcelain teacup, taking another slow, deeply satisfying sip of the warm chamomile tea. I set the cup down, leaned back against the plush velvet cushions of the sofa, and calmly crossed my arms over my chest. I looked at Preston, then at Jasmine, and finally at my mother. I slowly raised my right hand, extending my index finger. I did not point at any of them. Instead, I pointed directly past their shoulders, gesturing toward the deep dark shadows pooling in the far corner of the massive living room. My voice was incredibly calm, completely devoid of fear, and laced with absolute chilling authority. I think you should address my guests first, Preston. They have been waiting patiently for you to arrive all morning. The front door, already hanging precariously off its shattered hinges from the earlier tactical raid, was pushed fully open. Preston, Jasmine, and my mother instinctively stepped back, clustering together under the arched doorway. They expected to see local repairmen or perhaps private security guards I had hastily hired. Instead, they watched in absolute, paralyzing terror as three imposing figures stepped out from the deep shadows of the formal dining room and into the bright glare of the living room chandelier. The first man to step forward was Chief Marcus Thorne. He was still wearing his full-dress uniform, his gold badge gleaming against his dark chest. The second man was a tall, sharp-eyed white man wearing a tailored gray suit and a severe expression. He reached into his breast pocket and let a leather credential wallet flip open, revealing the unmistakable heavy silver shield of a special agent with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. The third man was someone my mother recognized instantly. It was Robert Vance, the senior estate lawyer who had managed my grandfather's historic portfolio for the past 30 years. Preston's arrogant, aggressive posture evaporated the second he saw the federal badge. His face drained of all color, matching the pale white of his wrinkled dress shirt. However, his toxic corporate survival instincts immediately kicked into overdrive. He aggressively pushed Jasmine slightly behind him and stepped forward, attempting to forcefully code switch. He abandoned the vicious shouting persona he had just used on me and instantly adopted the smooth, polite, and deeply concerned tone of an elite white-collar professional addressing his peers. He adjusted his jacket, flashed a strained, cooperative smile, and held his hands up in a gesture of peaceful surrender. "Officers, gentlemen, I am so incredibly relieved that you are here," Preston said, his voice dripping with fabricated sincerity. "I am Preston Vance, the financial executor for this estate. I am so sorry you had to be called out here on a holiday. As you can see, this is just a very simple, highly emotional family misunderstanding. My sister-in-law Nia has been struggling with some severe psychological issues lately. She became completely hysterical while we were out of the country and started playing dangerous games with my secured corporate servers. I assure you there is absolutely no need for federal involvement. I can handle my wife's family internally. We just need to get Nia the professional psychiatric help she clearly needs." Us. I remained perfectly still on the velvet sofa. I did not yell. I did not defend my sanity. I simply picked up my porcelain teacup, took a slow sip of the warm chamomile tea, and looked directly at Chief Thorne. The chief of police did not return Preston's polite smile. He looked at my brother-in-law with a level of profound disgust that made the air in the room feel incredibly heavy. Chief Thorne reached into his utility belt, pulled out his heavy black smartphone, and tapped the screen a few times. He did not say a single word. He simply turned the volume all the way up and pressed play. The audio filled the silent living room. It was not a recording of a financial transaction. It was the exact audio file of the fake 911 dispatch call Preston had made from the hotel lobby in Paris just hours earlier. Preston's own voice echoed off the walls, laced with fake panic, as he told the dispatcher that his mentally unstable black sister-in-law had taken his vulnerable grandfather hostage and was actively destroying the property with registered firearms. The recording played in its entirety, ending with the dispatcher promising to send a heavily armed tactical unit immediately. Chief Thorne paused the recording and slowly placed the phone back into his belt. "A simple family misunderstanding, Mr. Vance," the chief asked, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. "You used a masked European server to falsely deploy my tactical officers to the private residence of a retired federal district judge. You deliberately fabricated a violent hostage scenario, knowing exactly how a heavily armed response could escalate against an African American household. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a targeted, malicious, and highly illegal swatting attempt. You are currently facing state charges for filing a false police report, misuse of emergency services, and reckless endangerment." Preston's fake, polite smile completely vanished. His jaw dropped and he took a shaky step backward, bumping directly into Jasmine. I can explain that," Preston stammered, his confident facade shattering into a million pieces. "My servers were hacked. I was panicked. I thought my grandfather-in-law was in legitimate, immediate danger." "You did not think I was in danger, Preston," Grandpa Elijah said, his booming, authoritative voice cutting through the tension as he stood up from his leather recliner. "You knew exactly where I was. You knew because you intentionally abandoned me in a freezing, empty house so you could fly to Paris and steal my legacy." Jasmine grabbed Preston's arm, her eyes wide with mounting horror. She looked at the police chief, then at the IRS agent, and finally at me. "What is he talking about, Preston? What legacy? You said you got a massive corporate bonus. You said we were flying to Paris to celebrate your huge quarter at the firm." "Your husband does not have a firm, Jasmine," I said, finally speaking up from the sofa. I placed my teacup down and slid a thick-bound dossier across the mahogany coffee table. "His firm is a hollow, completely bankrupt shell. He has no major clients, no corporate bonuses, and absolutely no liquid assets. He is drowning in millions of dollars of high-interest liabilities. He orchestrated this entire European vacation to get Grandpa Elijah out of the house so he could use a forged medical document to steal $3 million. You did not think I was in danger, Preston," Grandpa Elijah said, his booming, authoritative voice cutting through the tension as he stood up from his leather recliner. "You knew exactly where I was. You knew because you intentionally abandoned me in a freezing, empty house so you could fly to Paris and steal my legacy." Jasmine's eyes darted between her grandfather and her husband. "What is he talking about, Preston? What legacy? You said you got a massive corporate bonus." "Your husband does not have a firm, Jasmine," I said, finally speaking up from the sofa. I placed my teacup down and slid a thick, bound dossier across the mahogany coffee table. "His firm is a hollow, completely bankrupt shell. He orchestrated this entire European vacation to get Grandpa Elijah out of the house so he could use a forged medical document to steal $3 million. Jasmine stared at the forensic accounting dossiers on the mahogany coffee table as if they were venomous snakes. The color completely drained from her perfectly contoured face. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grab the edge of the velvet sofa just to keep herself from collapsing. The words I had just spoken echoed through the tense, silent living room. $3 million of unsecured personal liability. It was a financial death sentence. For 3 years, Jasmine had paraded around Atlanta acting like absolute royalty. She had treated me like a peasant because she thought her marriage guaranteed her a lifetime of unlimited luxury. Now she was staring down the barrel of inescapable bankruptcy. "No!" Jasmine gasped, her voice trembling with raw terror. "No, that is impossible. Preston told me his firm was incredibly successful. He told me the collateral loan was just a temporary bridge. He said we had millions of dollars in offshore accounts." She turned her head to look at her husband. Preston was standing perfectly still, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he realized the IRS agent and the chief of police were blocking his only escape routes. He was trapped. "Preston!" Jasmine shrieked, the volume of her voice shattering the remaining tension in the room. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not just saddle me with $3 million of personal debt. I do not have that kind of money. I do not even have a job. You made me quit my marketing position so I could be a full-time socialite." Preston adjusted his wrinkled tie, his face flushed with toxic humiliation. "Shut up, Jasmine," he hissed, dropping his loving husband facade. "Do not act like you did not enjoy every second of the luxury I provided. You happily spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on designer clothes and luxury cars. You never questioned where the money came from because you were too busy showing off for your status-obsessed friends." Jasmine screamed. She lunged at Preston, striking his chest with her fists. She pounded against his expensive suit, sobbing hysterically. "You ruined my life. You lied to me. You used me. You told me you were an elite broker, but you are nothing but a broke, pathetic criminal. I am going to lose everything. I am going to go to federal prison because of you." The IRS special agent stepped forward, placing a firm hand on Jasmine's shoulder and pulling her away from Preston. The physical intervention only caused Jasmine's panic to escalate into absolute hysteria. She looked down at her bare wrist, remembering the diamond Rolex she had been forced to pawn just hours earlier in Paris. The reality of her sudden devastating poverty was finally crushing her. She spun around and threw herself at our mother. "Mom, you have to fix this," Jasmine begged, gripping Vivian's shoulders with desperate shaking hands. "You have to save me. I cannot be bankrupt. I cannot be a criminal. My friends will absolutely destroy me. They will laugh at me. You cannot let them take my car and my clothes. You have to pay this debt off right now." Vivian wrapped her arms around Jasmine, pulling her against her chest. My mother glared at me with a level of hatred so profound it radiated from her skin. Even now, faced with absolute proof of Preston's crimes, Vivian refused to hold him accountable. She refused to admit that her obsession with white-collar validation had destroyed her favorite daughter's life. Instead, she needed a scapegoat. She needed me to be the villain. "Do not cry, Jasmine," Vivian said, her voice shaking with arrogant, misplaced authority. "I am not going to let this jealous, miserable girl ruin your life. Nia is just trying to scare you with her fake numbers. She does not control this family. I am the matriarch of this household, and I make the final decisions here." My mother stepped away from Jasmine and marched directly toward the coffee table. She pointed a manicured finger at the federal agents and the chief of police, oblivious to the sheer danger of her own arrogance. "You have absolutely no right to be in my home," Vivian commanded, her voice ringing with toxic entitlement. "This estate belongs to me. My father is completely incompetent, which means I am the sole legal owner of this property and every commercial building attached to his name. If my daughter needs $3 million to clear this ridiculous misunderstanding, then I will provide it for her today." Vivian turned her vicious glare back to me, her chest heaving with pride. She truly believed she was playing the ultimate trump card. She believed she possessed the ultimate financial weapon to put me back in my place. "I am going to sell this historic house today," Vivian declared, her voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I am going to liquidate the Auburn Avenue properties by the end of the week. I will bail Jasmine out, and then I am going to hire the best defense attorneys in the state of Georgia to make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life behind bars for cyber terrorism, Nia. You are completely finished." I did not say a single word. I simply looked past my mother's shoulder. Behind Vivian, the rocking chair stopped moving. Grandpa Elijah placed his hands firmly on the armrests. He pushed himself up, standing to his full, imposing height. He did not stumble. He did not shake. He walked slowly across the Persian rug, his polished shoes silent against the fabric. He bypassed the tactical officers and the federal agents. He stopped directly behind my mother. Vivian froze as the tall shadow of her father fell over her. She slowly turned around, the arrogant confidence completely draining from her face. Grandpa Elijah looked Vivian dead in the eye, his voice rumbling like thunder through the quiet room. "You can't sell a damn thing, Vivian." Vivian let out a sharp gasp. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the Persian rug. She stared at my grandfather as if a ghost had materialized in her living room. For 6 months, she treated him like a burdensome piece of furniture. Now he was standing over her with the imposing authority of a federal judge. Vivian tried to recover her arrogant posture, smoothing her expensive coat. She forced a harsh laugh, desperately trying to maintain her delusion of control. "Do not be ridiculous, father," Vivian scolded, waving her hand in the air. You do not know what you are talking about. Your mind is completely gone. I have the official property deed locked away in my safe. I am the executor of this family, and I will sell this estate to whoever I please." Grandpa Elijah did not argue with her. He did not raise his voice or match her frantic energy. He simply raised his right hand and snapped his fingers once. Robert Vance, the family's senior estate lawyer, stepped forward from the shadows. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bearing the embossed seal of the state of Georgia. He walked directly over to my mother and pressed the heavy file flat against her chest, forcing her to take it. Vivian grabbed the papers, her eyes darting nervously between the lawyer and her father. "Read the first page, Vivian," Robert Vance instructed, his professional tone completely devoid of any sympathy. "Read the name listed under the primary ownership clause." Vivian flipped the cover open. Her eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs. Suddenly, the color drained from her face. Her hands began to violently shake, causing the pages to rustle loudly in the quiet room. She read the bolded words over and over again, her brain rejecting the undeniable reality printed on the page. "An irrevocable trust," Vivian whispered, her voice cracking with profound horror. "This says the entire estate and the Auburn Avenue commercial properties were transferred into a blind, irrevocable trust. This says I do not own anything. You own absolutely nothing." Grandpa Elijah confirmed, his voice striking her like a physical blow. "You do not own this house. You do not own the commercial real estate downtown. You do not own the antique furniture sitting in this living room. You are nothing but a temporary guest living on borrowed time." Jasmine let out a terrified sob, clutching her head in her hands. "Mom, what is he talking about? You said you were the sole heir. You promised Preston you controlled the entire portfolio." "I saw through your toxic vanity a long time ago, Vivian," Grandpa Elijah said, taking a step toward his daughter. "I watched you prioritize your fake social status over the well-being of your children. I watched you treat Nia like a disposable servant just because she did not fit into your desperate illusion of the black elite. You thought I was an old fool sitting quietly in the corner, but I watched every move you made." Grandpa Elijah turned to look at me, a deep sense of pride reflecting in his dark eyes. "5 years ago, you committed an unforgivable sin against this family," he continued, turning his glare to my mother. "Do you remember the day you forced Nia to drop out of her dream graduate program? You screamed at her. You told her she was a failure. You drained her college savings to pay for Jasmine's wedding to that parasite standing over there. You sacrificed Nia's brilliant future just to buy yourself a front row seat at a country club." Vivian opened her mouth to defend herself, but no words came out. She was completely paralyzed by her own exposed cruelty. On that exact same day, Grandpa Elijah declared, "I called Robert Vance into my office. I signed the paperwork to legally transfer every asset I possessed into an ironclad trust. I stripped you of your inheritance permanently, Vivian. I ensured you and Jasmine would never touch a single dime of the wealth I spent my life building." Vivian dropped the legal folder onto the floor. "Then who controls it?" she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at her father. "Who did you give my house to?" I stood up from the velvet sofa and walked over to the mahogany coffee table. I picked up the fallen folder and held it out toward my mother. "I am the sole trustee, Mom," I said, my voice echoing with cold authority. "I am the only legal executor. I own this historic estate. I own the Auburn Avenue properties. I own the ground you are standing on. I have been in complete control of this family's empire for 5 years. You thought you were the powerful matriarch pulling strings, but you were just a loud tenant living in my house." Jasmine collapsed onto the hardwood floor, screaming hysterically. Her mother could not sell the house. Her mother could not bail her out. The $3 million of unsecured personal debt was going to crush her. She was officially bankrupt, and she was going to lose everything she had cared about. Preston stood frozen near the front door. The devastating reality of the situation pierced through his arrogant delusion. The historic real estate he planned to steal was locked away in a trust he could never touch. His elite investment firm was exposed as a criminal fraud. The $3 million loan was a personal liability. He looked at the chief of police blocking the foyer. He looked at the armed IRS special agent standing near the hallway. He realized he was not walking out as a wealthy corporate broker. He was going to walk out in handcuffs, heading to a federal penitentiary. Panic flooded Preston's eyes. Survival instinct completely took over his rational brain. He spun around, abandoning his sobbing wife on the floor, and bolted aggressively toward the back door of the kitchen. Preston did not make it 3 steps. Before his shoes reached the kitchen archway, the IRS special agent moved with terrifying speed. The agent lunged forward, intercepting Preston with precise efficiency. He grabbed Preston firmly by his tailored collar, using the fleeing man's frantic momentum against him. With a sharp pivot, the federal agent lifted Preston completely off his feet and slammed him face first into the thick plaster of the living room wall. The heavy impact rattled the framed photographs, sending a large picture of Preston and Jasmine's lavish wedding crashing to the floor. The glass shattered across the Persian rug, mirroring the absolute destruction of his fraudulent empire. Preston gasped, his face pressed painfully against the cold wall. He thrashed his shoulders, attempting to fight his way out of the iron grip, but the IRS agent drove his forearm deep into the center of Preston's back. The tactical movement pinned the disgraced broker in place. Chief Thorne stepped forward, his boots crunching over the broken glass of the wedding portrait. The chief reached out, grabbing Preston's right wrist and violently twisting it behind his back. The sharp sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly over human wrists echoed through the silent room. This time the chains were locking around the correct target. "Preston Vance, you are officially under federal arrest." The IRS special agent declared, his voice cutting through the room with absolute authority. "You are charged with multiple counts of aggravated wire fraud, systemic tax evasion, and international money laundering. Furthermore, local authorities are charging you with filing a false police report, misuse of emergency services, and reckless endangerment of a retired federal judge. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in court. You have the right to an attorney." "I know my rights," Preston roared in absolute defiance, his voice muffled against the drywall. Chief Thorne grabbed Preston by the shoulders and forcefully spun him around. Preston stumbled awkwardly, his balance thrown off by his restrained hands. He stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by federal agents, his face flushed an angry crimson. The polite white-collar persona he used to manipulate my mother instantly evaporated. His hidden offshore accounts were totally exposed, his fraudulent firm was dismantled, and his access to my grandfather's wealth was permanently blocked. Stripped of his money and his freedom, the true ugly core of his personality violently clawed its way out. Preston glared at Jasmine, who was kneeling on the floor, weeping hysterically into her hands. Then he turned his furious gaze toward my mother Vivian, standing frozen in shock near the fireplace. He looked at them with profound, toxic, and absolute contempt. "Look at yourselves," Preston sneered, spitting the words out like venom. "You are both absolutely pathetic. You actually believed a man like me would genuinely want to be part of a family like yours. You are nothing but desperate, status-obsessed fools. You were so eager to buy your way into elite white society that you practically begged me to take your money. You handed me the keys to your entire financial existence just so you could parade me around like a prize." "Preston, stop it," Jasmine sobbed, reaching a shaking hand toward him. "How can you say these things? I am your wife. We were supposed to build a beautiful life." Preston let out a cruel, mocking laugh. "A beautiful life, Jasmine. You were never my wife. You are a convenient, incredibly gullible financial shield. You are a loud, obnoxious liability. The only reason I put up with your suffocating presence was because I needed to get close to that old man's historic real estate portfolio. I needed clean capital to save my business, and you were the easiest, most desperate target I ever met." Vivian gasped loudly, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically stabbed. "We welcomed you into our home," my mother cried in profound shock. "We treated you with absolute respect. We gave you everything you asked for. You gave me what I wanted because you are desperate for white validation, Vivian." Preston shouted, his mask completely slipping into vile, racially charged arrogance. "You despise your roots so much that you would rather sell out your brilliant daughter than admit you were wrong about me. You treated Nia like garbage to impress me, and look exactly where that pathetic subservience got you. You are bankrupt. You are homeless. You are exactly the ignorant stereotype you spent your life escaping. The brutality of his insults hung heavily in the freezing air. He pinpointed their deepest, darkest insecurities and violently ripped them wide open for the entire room to witness. He had never respected them or cared about their well-being. He only viewed them as easily manipulated pawns in his desperate predatory financial scheme. Chief Thorne had heard enough of his toxic ranting. He aggressively grabbed Preston by the bicep, violently jerking him forward and throwing him off balance. "Shut your mouth, Vance," the chief ordered with deep, unwavering disgust. "You are done talking. You are going to spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary thinking about this exact moment." The IRS special agent flanked Preston on his other side. Together, they forcefully marched the disgraced broker toward the shattered front door. Preston struggled against their heavy grip, kicking his expensive shoes against the hardwood floor. But it was absolutely useless. He was completely overpowered. Jasmine watched her husband being marched away. The devastating reality of her situation crushed the last remaining breath from her lungs. She realized her perfect marriage was nothing but a predatory scam designed to steal her grandfather's legacy. She let out a loud, agonizing, primal scream. Jasmine collapsed completely flat onto the hardwood floor, her body violently shaking as the illusion of her wealthy, elite life was totally destroyed, while Preston was aggressively dragged out of the historic house in heavy steel handcuffs. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind Preston, the sharp sound echoing through the silent, massive living room. His departure left a sudden, deafening vacuum in the historic estate. For the last 3 years, he had completely suffocated this family with his toxic, arrogant presence. Now he was securely locked inside a federal vehicle, his life completely ruined. Jasmine was still curled up on the hardwood floor, sobbing uncontrollably. The absolute realization that her elite, luxurious marriage was a predatory scam had entirely broken her spirit. She was 30 years old, completely bankrupt, legally tied to a convicted felon, and staring down the barrel of $3 million of personal unsecured debt. Her perfect manicured life was entirely gone. I stood by the mahogany coffee table watching my younger sister weep. For a brief second, the deeply ingrained habit of the older sister tried to surface. The old Nia would have knelt down, hugged Jasmine, and promised to fix everything. I would have drained my own savings to pay off her debts just to keep the peace. But the old Nia had died the moment I read that cruel sticky note in the dark kitchen. The new Nia, the sole trustee of the entire family empire, remained perfectly still. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. Vivian, however, was not broken. My mother was cornered, and like any cornered narcissist, she immediately began to pivot. She slowly stood up from the velvet sofa, her eyes darting between Jasmine and me. She smoothed down her expensive designer coat, adjusting her posture. She was desperately trying to salvage whatever tiny scrap of authority she thought she still possessed. She took a tentative step toward me, her face morphing into a mask of deep, fabricated maternal sorrow. "Nia, sweetheart," Vivian began, her voice trembling with practiced emotion. "You have to understand why I did all of this. You have to understand the immense pressure I was under." I did not move. I just stared at her, my face completely devoid of any emotion. "I just wanted our family to be excellent," my mother pleaded, taking another step closer, holding her hands out toward me. "I wanted us to sit at the highest tables in Atlanta. I wanted people to look at us and see success, not struggle. I pushed you so hard because I knew you were brilliant. I knew you could achieve greatness if you just stopped being so stubborn. And yes, maybe I relied too heavily on Preston, but I truly believed he was elevating our status. I thought he was securing our legacy in the white corporate world. I did it all for this family, Nia. I did it for you and your sister." Her words were a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. She was actively trying to rewrite the devastating abuse of the last 30 years into a story of tough love and maternal sacrifice. She was attempting to excuse the fact that she had just tried to render her own daughter homeless by claiming she was simply trying to build a perfect empire. She expected me to soften. She expected me to understand her toxic vanity. I reached down and picked up a slim black folder from the coffee table. This was not a legal document from my grandfather's trust. This was a completely separate dossier I had compiled during my extensive forensic investigation. I held the black folder up, making sure my mother could clearly see the bank logo printed on the cover. "You did not do any of this for me, Mom," I said, my voice cold and sharp. "And you certainly did not do it to build a legacy. You did it to fund a delusion." I opened the black folder and pulled out a thick stack of credit card statements. They spanned back nearly a decade, covering the exact timeline of my early career. When I was 23 years old, I worked 3 different jobs just to pay my rent while I built my forensic accounting firm. I stated, staring directly into my mother's widening eyes. I saved every single penny I earned. I ate cheap ramen noodles for weeks. I skipped every vacation. I did not buy a new pair of shoes for 2 entire years. I thought I was struggling because the economy was tough. I threw the first stack of statements onto the coffee table. The papers fanned out, revealing highlighted charges from luxury boutiques, expensive hair salons, and high-end Atlanta country clubs. "I was not struggling because of the economy, Mom," I continued, my voice rising with righteous fury. "I was struggling because you had secretly forged my signature and opened a joint credit account in my name. You siphoned thousands of dollars out of my early career savings to pay for your expensive lunches with your judgmental church friends. You stole my money to buy the designer clothes you wore while you publicly called me a failure." Vivian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of the sofa. "Nia, please, you do not understand. I needed to maintain appearances. I needed to look the part so I could network for your sister's future." "You are a thief," I said, the absolute truth ringing loudly in the silent room. "You are not a matriarch. You are not a symbol of Black excellence. You are a petty, status-obsessed thief who actively stole from her own struggling daughter just to buy a fake seat at a table of people who do not even like you." Jasmine stopped crying for a moment, looking up at our mother in profound shock. Even the golden child was horrified by the sheer depth of Vivian's financial betrayal. "And then," I added, stepping closer to my mother, "when Preston offered you a chance to steal Grandpa Elijah's entire real estate portfolio, you did not hesitate. You happily conspired to throw me out onto the street. You literally wrote in an email that I was an embarrassing, unmarried failure who deserved to be homeless." Vivian was completely trapped. The irrefutable, undeniable evidence of her lifelong cruelty was spread out across the mahogany table. She could not gaslight her way out of stolen bank statements and documented emails. Her entire identity, built on superiority and perfection, was completely annihilated. I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely zero emotion. The fear, the desperation, and the desperate need for her approval were entirely gone. I was the sole trustee. I was the owner of the historic estate. I was completely in charge. "You care so much about what society thinks, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet whisper. "Let's see what they think when you're homeless. You have exactly 1 hour to pack your bags." The 60-minute countdown began immediately, and the chaos that followed was a symphony of justice. Now they were shoving their expensive designer wardrobes into heavy black plastic trash bags. I stood in the hallway, leaning against the mahogany banister, holding my phone. I had the timer clearly displayed, ensuring they knew I was enforcing every second of their eviction. She sprinted up the curved staircase, tripping over her heels to salvage whatever she could from her bedroom. I followed her, watching as the golden child completely unraveled. She ripped open her closet, pulling silk dresses off velvet hangers, desperately stuffing them into the bags I had tossed onto her floor. "This cannot be happening," Jasmine sobbed, her chest heaving as she shoved shoes into a bag. "I cannot be bankrupt. I am supposed to be a wealthy wife. My friends are going to humiliate me. They will ban me from the country club. I do not even know how to apply for a job, Nia. I have not worked in 3 years. You cannot do this to your sister. You should have thought about your resume before conspiring to throw me onto the freezing street," I replied, perfectly level. "You have 45 minutes, Jasmine. Focus on packing practical clothing. You will not need diamond-studded heels where you are going." She let out a piercing scream, burying her tear-stained face into expensive silk scarves. The reality of her predatory marriage was crushing her. Preston had completely destroyed her credit, ruined her reputation, and left her responsible for a $3 million liability. She would spend the next decade fending off debt collectors. Her manicured life was over. While Jasmine fell apart, my mother experienced a different type of destruction. Vivian moved through the historic estate like a shattered ghost. Her matriarchal posture had collapsed, her shoulders slumped, and her eyes were vacant. The realization that she owned nothing had broken her narcissistic mind. For decades, she used this massive house to project immense generational wealth. Now she was an unwelcome trespasser, being forcefully evicted by the daughter she deemed a failure. I walked back to the living area, finding my mother wandering near the formal dining room. She was dragging a black garbage bag behind her, the plastic rustling loudly. She was searching for anything to validate her shattered ego. Suddenly, Vivian stopped in front of the fireplace, her eyes locked onto a valuable painting resting on the mantel. It was a historic landscape portrait Grandpa Elijah's father had purchased decades ago, a cherished family heirloom. Vivian reached out, pulling the heavy gold frame off the mantel. She clutched the painting tightly against her chest, trying to slip it into her garbage bag. She thought she could sneak away with one last piece of stolen wealth. I crossed the room in 3 silent strides. I reached out and firmly clamped my hand down on the gold frame. Vivian gasped, looking up at me with terrified eyes. "Let go of it, Nia," my mother pleaded, her voice cracking with pathetic entitlement. "This is a family heirloom. It belongs to me. I am the mother of this household." "You are a thief," I corrected her, my grip tightening with absolute authority. "As of 5 years ago, this painting, this mantle, and this entire estate belong exclusively to my trust. You do not get to steal from my grandfather ever again." I yanked the painting out of her hands. Vivian let out a sharp cry, stumbling backward. She looked at her empty hands, the realization hitting her like a freight train. I was not going to let her leave with a single ounce of dignity. I placed the heirloom back onto the mantel, smoothing the canvas. I turned to face her, checking the digital timer on my screen. "You have exactly 10 minutes, I stated coldly. "Get your bags and get out." The final 10 minutes were a blur of frantic shuffling. Jasmine dragged 3 bulging garbage bags down the staircase, her face swollen from crying. Vivian followed closely behind her, carrying 2 bags, completely silent and defeated. I walked right behind them, guiding them toward the front foyer. Chief Thorne and the IRS agent had left to process Preston's federal booking, leaving Grandpa Elijah and me to witness their final departure. Grandpa Elijah remained seated in his recliner, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a formal goodbye. He watched them drag their trash across his floors with profound righteous disgust. I opened the shattered oak front door, letting the freezing winter wind sweep into the warm foyer. Jasmine and Vivian stepped out onto the concrete porch, the harsh reality of the freezing Atlanta evening hitting them instantly. They slowly dragged their garbage bags down the front steps, the plastic scraping loudly against the rough concrete. They had no luxury SUV waiting. Preston's premium accounts were entirely frozen, and their credit cards were locked. They had to use the last few dollars of cash they possessed to order a cheap rideshare vehicle. I stepped onto the threshold, watching the 2 women who had tormented me my entire life walk away in disgrace. They dragged their bags all the way down the long, winding gravel driveway, their heels slipping into the cold stones. They reached the bottom of the hill, shivering violently in the winter air, waiting for a cheap car to take them to a miserable future. Vivian slowly turned her head, looking back up the driveway toward the brightly lit estate. She looked directly at me, standing tall and victorious in the entryway. I did not offer a sympathetic smile. I did not offer a wave goodbye. I locked eyes with Vivian one last time, raised my chin, and pulled the heavy oak door shut with a resounding final click. The massive historic house was finally silent, completely free of their toxic presence forever. I had finally won. I rested my forehead against the cool wood of the front door, taking a deep cleansing breath. For the first time in 33 years, the air inside this estate did not feel heavy or suffocating. There was no lingering anxiety, No impending dread of a harsh critique, and no toxic tension vibrating through the hallways. The silence was not empty. It was profound, beautiful, and absolutely golden. I slowly walked away from the foyer and made my way back into the grand living room. The tactical units were long gone, and the federal agents had taken Preston away to face his inevitable ruin. The only evidence that the chaotic confrontation had even occurred was the shattered glass of Preston and Jasmine's lavish wedding portraits scattered across the Persian rug. I walked over to the mahogany coffee table, grabbed a small broom from the hallway closet, and carefully swept up the broken pieces of their fabricated fairy tale. I dumped the glittering shards into the nearest trash bin without a single ounce of remorse. When I looked up, Grandpa Elijah was still sitting in his favorite leather recliner. He was not looking at the front door. He was watching the large front windows. Small, delicate white flakes were beginning to drift down from the dark night sky, catching the glow of the outdoor security lights. It was finally starting to gently snow outside. "It is cold out there tonight," Grandpa Elijah remarked, a faint, satisfied smile playing on his lips. "It certainly is," I replied, walking over to the fireplace to stoke the dying embers. "Let me make us something warm." I went into the kitchen and prepared 2 large mugs of rich hot cocoa, a simple luxury we used to share when I was a little girl, long before my mother's obsession with status consumed our lives. I brought the steaming mugs back into the living room, handing one to my grandfather before taking a seat on the velvet sofa. We sat in comfortable silence, sipping the sweet chocolate, watching the snow gently blanket the expansive front lawn. The heavy, oppressive weight of the past 3 decades was completely gone. We had successfully defended our family legacy, and we had permanently excised the parasites who sought to destroy it. The immense relief was intoxicating. The consequences of that freezing Christmas Eve rippled out over the next several months with brutal, poetic justice. The federal government did not offer Preston any lenient plea deals. Agent Vance and the Internal Revenue Service absolutely dismantled his fraudulent corporate empire. Preston faced a mountain of undeniable digital evidence and a jury that had zero sympathy for a white-collar criminal who preyed on the elderly. He was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant investment broker, who used to wear custom-tailored suits and sip expensive champagne, was now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He was entirely powerless, stripped of his arrogant charm, and locked in a concrete cell where his manipulative code switching could not save him. Jasmine faced an equally devastating reality. With Preston in prison and the $3 million fraudulent loan tied directly to her personal Social Security number, she was forced to declare total bankruptcy. The banks repossessed her luxury vehicles, and her designer wardrobe was auctioned off to pay her mounting legal fees. Stripped of her wealthy identity, she had to move into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. The sister who once mocked me for working a real job was forced to accept a minimum wage position at a local retail store. She spent her days folding cheap clothes and dealing with rude customers, completely abandoned by the elite socialite friends she had tried so desperately to impress. They blocked her phone number the second the federal indictment hit the local news. My mother experienced the most profound social isolation of all. Vivian had built her entire existence around projecting superiority within her affluent church community. When the details of her attempted theft and the tactical police raid became public knowledge, she became an instant pariah. The church board respectfully asked her to step down from her leadership positions, and her wealthy friends pretended they did not see her at the grocery store. She ended up renting a rundown, one-bedroom apartment far away from her former country club. She spent her days staring out the window, surrounded by the cheap knockoff bags she bought to replace the ones she pawned in Paris. Her pride was entirely shattered, and her grand illusions of matriarchal power were nothing but a bitter, painful memory. She had sacrificed her brilliant daughter for a front-row seat at a table that permanently revoked her invitation. Meanwhile, I stepped fully into my power. I officially took over the management of Grandpa Elijah's multi-million-dollar real estate empire. We invested heavily in the Auburn Avenue commercial properties, bringing new Black-owned businesses into the historic downtown spaces and revitalizing the entire block. My forensic accounting firm expanded exponentially, attracting high-profile corporate clients who respected my ruthless efficiency and unbreakable integrity. I was no longer the family scapegoat hiding in the shadows. I was the architect of my own incredibly successful destiny, surrounded by people who valued my intellect and my loyalty. As the fire crackled warmly in the hearth on that first snowy Christmas night, I looked over at the man who had always believed in my potential. Grandpa Elijah took a final contented sip of his hot cocoa and set the mug down on the wooden side table. He turned his head, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners, as he looked at me with profound, immeasurable pride. "Not a bad Christmas, granddaughter," he said to me softly. I took a deep breath, feeling absolute peace settling right into my bones. I smiled back at him. "Not bad at all, my very dear grandpa.